Author Janice Phillip explores the history and creation of Upper Canada by blending fact and fiction in her new book, The Silent Canoe. And Janice joins us now here in the studio. It's great to have you here.
Happy to be here, Steve.
It's pretty funny. I guess we should tell people how this happened, eh?
We should.
You and I both went to the same event at the Toronto Public Library one night.
Yes.
And you came up to me and said, I've written a new book about War of 1812 and the founding of Upper Canada, and you should read it.
Exactly.
So I said, okay, and here you are.
And here I am, and you did read it, and I'm so happy you did.
And not only that, enjoyed it. So let's get into it. Your book opens by putting us into Ontario, or of course as it was then called Upper Canada, 220 years ago. And I want to start by asking, what's so captivating about that time in our history that made you want to devote your life to writing this book about it?
Well, it is very captivating to me, and basically it's because Ontario, or Upper Canada, was a blank slate. It was a vast wilderness. All it was trees 6 feet wide. There was no towns, no roads, no villages, no stores. The only thing that there was a lot of Aboriginal people. And at that time, a lot of the Aboriginals were the Anishinaabe, which we know of as the Mississaugas. They were nomadic, so they didn't settle in towns. They changed with the seasons. So there was a lot of people living in the forest, but other than that, it was like a big blank forest. That's all it was. And what do you do with that? How do you start? Where do you go? And so that's what intrigued me.
Well, you start by telling us about a guy named Isaac Devans, who is your chief protagonist in the book. And I guess the first question is, did he really exist?
He did.
There was a guy named Isaac Devans back then.
There was a guy named Isaac Devans back then. And I first learned about him when I was doing my work as a landscape architect. And I was hired to do a historical landscape master plan for an area in Toronto and to create a number of historic signs. And he was the first person who had settled in that area. And it's called Emery Village. It's, I guess you could say it's at Weston Road and Finch.
Northwest part of the city.
Northwest part of the city. And so basically I got to know him through that research that I did for that project.
And tell us a little bit about him.
Well, he came up to Upper Canada with his family, his extended family, his brothers and his father and all of their wives and children. And they came up, they were living in basically in the upper New York State in the Orange County area. And they came up when free land was offered by Governor Simcoe. And that was in 1793.
That would be Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe.
John Graves Simcoe.
The guy we named the holiday in August after.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so Governor Simcoe really wanted to populate the province because at that time there was only about 100 or 200 people, settlers in the province. Although there were thousands of Aboriginals, there was only about 100 or 200 settlers. So he needed people to come up. So Governor Simcoe himself, he went down to New York State and he posted signs that advertised free land in Upper Canada. Come up, settle up here, you get free land. So
what kind of response did he get?
Well, he got some, but you know, there was not a lot of trust there. People didn't trust that it was for real, or they didn't know what kind of reception they would actually get. Maybe it was just a hoax or a ruse to actually bring people up and then jail them or worse. So
they didn't believe the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada?
Some didn't.
I'm shocked.
Some definitely didn't.
But Isaac did.
He did, and he convinced his family to come up. So they came up in February 1793, and they basically decided to settle in Upper Canada and take advantage of the free land.
More on that in a second. I want to go to the reasons why your fascination for this time didn't result in you just simply writing historical fact. Why have you written a fictitious account of what happened at the time?
Well, I would say I would take a little...
You're taking umbrage with my premise here.
Yeah, with the word fictitious, because a lot of it is very real. Most of the events that I've talked about did happen. And I guess when I was doing my research, I researched from about 200 or 300 sources, most of them nonfiction books. So when I thought about what I was going to create, I wondered whether I was going to create just another nonfiction book that would join that collection, or would I do something different? And there wasn't really any historical fiction about Toronto at all, or Upper Canada, very little. So I wanted to actually reach a group that hadn't been reached yet.
You had to make up dialogue, I presume, though, yes?
Yes,
And
definitely.
you take some liberties there, or what?
Well, you have to. I mean, we don't know what people actually said. There wasn't a lot of recording back then, and we don't know what actually happened except for some few written accounts. For instance, in the legislature when they were debating issues, we know basically what was passed, but we don't know what happened when they were debating those issues, for example. And when Governor Simcoe decided to go to York and establish a community there.
York meaning Toronto.
York meaning Toronto. We don't know exactly what he said to encourage people to go. So there's a lot of dialogue that you have to make up just to really depict the history and what it was probably like.
Sure, and let's remember, the provincial capital was not at Queen's Park like it is today.
Exactly.
It was Niagara-on-the-Lake, I guess, back then.
It was in Niagara-on-the-Lake, exactly.
Which I'm not even sure they called it that. Didn't they call it Newark?
It was called Newark, and that was something that Governor Simcoe did because he wanted to anglicize the province, so he set about changing a lot of the names that we're familiar with, that we did not have before, into something that we do know. So Niagara-on-the-Lake, it wasn't called Niagara-on-the-Lake, it was just called Niagara. And then they changed it to Newark at that time. And that is where the legislature was for that time.
Let me ask you about another guy, because not far from the studio is Jarvis Street.
Yes.
And not far from the studio is a school called Jarvis Collegiate.
Yes.
And presumably it's named after this guy, William Jarvis,
Yes.
who you really do not portray as a good guy in this book. Was he really that bad a guy?
He really was.
He was, okay.
He was, and I just take that from what I have read about him. So that's not something that I made up. It is actually something that I read. And actually, if you go on the Jarvis Collegiate website and you look at their website, they really depict him in even worse of a light than I have. And, you know, they call him a rogue and a loathsome person. How could we even name our school after this person? So he really did have some qualities that were a little bit deplorable. He wasn't reliable in what he did, and he was in the aristocratic class. He really did not want to associate with anybody that was below that. So he really separated himself from people, sat on his high horse, so to speak, and you know, he did some things that were really objectionable.
Well, let me ask you about moving the capital here. We just touched on this a second ago, but John Graves Simcoe had the idea that he wanted to move it from Niagara, as it then was, to York, now Toronto. Why do you want to move the capital city? That's a pretty big move.
Well, most of it was fear. And at that point, the British had not given up Fort Niagara yet. So they still were across the river from Newark. There was Fort Niagara. They still had occupation of that. Even though the Americans had won that after the War of Independence, the British still had it. So he had received orders from Lord Dorchester that they had to vacate that. The British had to vacate that. And from
the War of Independence, as in 1776.
Yes.
And the British, so America's independent, but the Brits still have a fort in America.
Yes.
That they control.
They controlled all the forts along all the lakes.
It's like the Guantanamo Bay of its day.
Exactly.
Okay.
They did that up until about 1795, 1796. That's when they finally gave back the forts through the treaty of the Jay Treaty. They were
so
forced to do
Simcoe's
that.
thinking, if the Americans take over that fort, we can't have our capital this close to that.
Exactly. He's thinking it's way too close. I can hear them when they're firing off their cannons. I can see them marching. I can hear their military band. I just don't want them that close. There is also a geographical reality as well, that if you actually just look at it on a map, it's as if it's a flat shoreline with Niagara on one side and Newark on the other and the river between. So there's nothing to really stop them from crossing the river and being attacked. There was really no natural geographical defense.
Was there much opposition to moving the capital to York?
There was some. There definitely was some. There was a lot of people that just did not want to go to Toronto. And that's because at that point, Toronto really was it was viewed as an uninhabitable place.
Some people still think that.
Some people still think that, that's true. And so I guess basically what it was is that back then, the Toronto Islands were not islands. They were still connected to the mainland. And that was at the mouth of the Don River. And at the mouth of the Don River was a huge swamp. And the swamp was full of mosquitoes and malaria. So it was really looked on as a very unhealthy place to go. And actually, Elizabeth Simcoe, after the death of her child, they actually left Toronto because they just did not consider it a healthy place to raise a family at all.
Did anybody point out to the governor that you want to call this place York and make it the capital? There's a place called New York not that far away. Aren't you worried people are going to be confused?
Yes, that definitely was a consideration, and a lot of people actually told that to Governor Simcoe, but he was adamant that it be called York. And the reason for that was, again, his fear that the Americans were going to attack. He was so afraid, and what he wanted to do was he wanted to just really bring in the idea that people had to be loyal to the British Crown. So he named it York after the Duke of York, who was the son of King George III, because the Duke of York had just won a battle in Flanders. And so he wanted to commemorate that. And that battle was because Britain had just been called to war by the French. The French Revolution had just begun. And the French Revolution was another fear of Governor Simcoe because he had just been through the American Revolution. So here are the French people coming together, getting rid of their monarchies, sending Marie Antoinette and King Louis to the guillotine. And then their people are rising up, and now they've declared war against Britain. So he wanted to try to get rid of any idea of democracy, any idea of, people coming together and overthrowing the monarchy as far as he could. So what he did was he tried to really anglicize things. So get rid of all of the names like Toronto and Niagara and change them into names that people are familiar with.
Well, let me fast forward you just for a moment here. So we became York, but then in 1834 they changed the name back to Toronto. Why'd they do that?
Well, I think it was the exact reason that you're saying. It was too confusing with New York. And Governor Simcoe had changed it to York. He was the only one that really wanted that to happen. After that, nobody really cared that it was called York, and people were still referring to it as Toronto anyways.
And then he left, so what the heck?
And he was gone, and people were calling it Toronto, so why not change it back?
Let's, I really want to get a better understanding. You pointed out there was nothing here in terms of European settlement originally, 220 years ago, when your book is situated. And I want to know, when people first came here, the Europeans, to try to establish a city, how did they decide, you get this land, you get that land? How did they work all that out?
Well, it was, there was a lot of patronage, as you can imagine. So a lot of the people that were, in the government, that were part of the legislature, they got the land that they wanted, as much as they wanted and where they wanted. The rest of it was basically up for grabs by all the settlers that were coming in. But it wasn't a very organized system. They had just established the land registry system, but it wasn't a well-run unit.
So you didn't just poach. You didn't just say, I claim this, and there was some kind of system.
There was a system. First you had to swear allegiance to the king. Then you had to actually register a petition. So you had to describe your land somehow. And that required a land survey to be created. Without a land survey, you could only say, well, that rock over there and next to that stream, there's no way to describe it. So once a land survey was done, you made your petition, then you waited. And you just waited, and if it was granted, you got your yellow paper, and that yellow paper was gold.
That was your deed, I guess.
That was your deed, and that was the only record. They didn't have the storage systems that we have today.
So what if you lost your deed, or somebody stole it or ripped it up, or what happened then?
Well, if it was stolen or ripped up, then the land was up for grabs. Anybody could claim it after that.
Did people try to do that or steal other people's land?
Oh, they definitely did. That was something they definitely did. And that's why people took that yellow paper, they hid it away, and they wouldn't even show anybody, because all somebody had to do was rip it and it was gone.
And if you got caught doing that?
If you got caught doing that, well, I'm sure there was some punishment. I don't know exactly what the punishment was for that, but I'm sure it was fairly severe, because what I do know is at that time they had boundary markers. Basically, just, I guess, pylons of some sort, and, marking trees, and that's what marked your property back then. But the punishment for moving those was death.
You got the death penalty for moving the property markers?
Yes.
How did they kill you?
I'm sure that it was by hanging.
Whew. That's pretty serious.
Yes.
Let me draw your attention to what would have been another huge debate at the time, and that is the decision on whether to allow slavery in Upper Canada, because, of course, they had it south of the border. How did we figure that out up here?
Well, it was something that was really spearheaded by Governor Simcoe. He was really against slavery. He thought it was an abhorrent practice that he did not want to have happen in his new province. So he brought it up at the second legislature. He wrote a piece of legislation with John White, who is the Attorney General of Upper Canada, and he introduced it to the House. And basically what the original legislature said was that slaves will not be permitted in Upper Canada anymore.
Were there slaves there already?
There were.
There were some?
There were quite a few, actually, because anybody who was on the legislature, most of them had slaves. And that's why when he introduced the bill to the House, there was a lot of opposition.
Huh. So it existed, and Simcoe had to bring in a bill abolishing it.
To abolish it, yes.
And we did this 50 years before the United States did. Maybe more. More than that. 60 years before they did.
Exactly.
Huh.
And it was very interesting because he introduced the bill, but he had to backtrack on it, because he received so much opposition from the people that were in the legislature that he ended up couching it so that instead of abolishing slavery outright, it allowed slavery to continue for those people that already had slaves, but no new slavery. If people came in the next day and brought slaves in, that would not be permitted.
So those who had got grandfathered, if you like.
Exactly. It was a grandfather clause.
Well, let's just play this through then. We know that in the United States, 500,000 people had to die in order to abolish slavery.
Yes.
They had the most horrendous civil war imaginable. Mm-hmm. How did we eventually deal with it here?
Well, Steve, it really, once they did pass that legislation, people did not bring slaves in.
But for the existing slaves, it was just a matter of...
Just a matter of waiting for their owners to pass on, and then their families were free again.
So they couldn't pass on their slaves to the next generation?
No,
Once they were dead, that was it?
Yes.
And that's how we ended it?
That's how we ended it.
Okay. Let's talk about the relationships between the new European settlers and the indigenous people who were already here for many thousands of years. You describe one scene in the book where Indian bands essentially maraud and attack newcomers and kidnap their children, and I want to know how much of all of that went on at the time.
Well, it definitely went on at the time because there was a frontier land, and that was between New York State and Niagara. All that land in between there really was a frontier, and that's where all of it took place, was anybody that was daring to go through there. So that was basically people that were emigrating. They basically would come up through there and come to Niagara. But you really risked your life to be doing that because there definitely was a possibility that you might be attacked. Your horses might be taken. Many times the men were killed and the women were taken and the children were taken. And it didn't happen all the time, but it did happen some of the times.
Did it not occur to the new European settlers of the time that maybe this was happening because they were attempting to steal land that was already occupied?
Well, I don't know that answer, but you would think so, definitely.
Yeah. I have been told that the initial contact between Indigenous peoples and Europeans was actually better than a lot of the history paints. That treaties were signed, that understandings were made. When you did your research for this, did you find evidence of that?
Well, I did. It depends how you look at it. Treaties were signed, but they weren't necessarily beneficial to the Aboriginal people.
I see.
So I wouldn't say, it depends how you look at it from the Aboriginal point of view. I can think of the purchase of Toronto. That so-called deed that was signed, when they actually looked at it, they couldn't really even tell if there was a signature on it. Because at that point, the Aboriginals, instead of writing a name, they would like draw a picture of an owl or a fox or whatever animal was representing their clan. And you couldn't even tell that anybody had actually really signed it. And what they got for the exchange of land was so minimal that, I wouldn't say that relations were necessarily good. But what I could say is that on just a one-on-one level, many settlers actually ended up settling with the native people. Now, maybe they preferred their culture, their way of life, their spirituality, but they decided to, instead of just move into the wilderness on their own, to go with some of the native groups and actually join their community. And that happened quite a bit in the first 20 or 30 years.
So there was intermingling of the different cultures.
There definitely was.
And did that work?
It did, in a sense. I mean, I didn't hear anything where it didn't work. And I think the people that were integrated did so willingly, so I think they were happy to do so. And it definitely is something, we don't really hear about that too often, but it's definitely something that did happen, and it just shows that basically that the Aboriginals and the settlers could get along if they wanted to, definitely.
Let me ask you about that land sale again, because I think I remember learning 100 years ago in school about some Dutch explorer named Peter Minuit or something, who gave the Indian tribes of New York 24 guilders, and he bought Manhattan Island for that. I mean, for a song, right? The Indians sold Manhattan Island for a song. Do we have any evidence? I don't know. Is the piece of paper still around today of the so-called sale of Toronto from the Mississaugas of the New Credit to the European settlers of the time?
Yes, we have that paper. We know what the exchange was, and it basically was so many shotguns, so much gunpowder, and bushels of wheat, and other goods like that. It was probably enough that could maybe be put on half a ship, and that's basically what they sold the whole town of Toronto for.
Boy. We got to make good on that, don't we?
I mean, I think so.
It's been 220 years, but that feels like a caveat emptor situation, doesn't it?
It does, and it's interesting because at that point, the idea of land ownership was just so completely foreign to the Aboriginals. It wasn't even in their language. They didn't even understand that idea. So many Aboriginals, they didn't really realize that they were selling land. They thought that they were sharing land. They thought that basically the settlers were coming in and they would be using the land along with the Aboriginals, and not that they would no longer be able to use the same land as well. And in many cases, they actually thought the settlers to be foolish for signing these agreements. Why should they give us money? Because we don't own this land. Nobody owns this land. And they're going to give us money for them to use it. Why would they do that? That's ridiculous.
And a completely different understanding and approach to land use, land ownership.
Exactly.
So obviously they didn't have any pieces of paper or deeds or anything to suggest this is my land and I'm selling it to you.
No, that did not exist. To them, Mother Nature owned land, and and Mother Nature was sharing it with them and with everybody.
Interesting. This takes place 220 years ago, and I wonder 220 years later, are there any people still living in this town whose roots go back to then?
There definitely are. I know there's members of the Jarvis family and members of the Devins family. In fact, there's about 700 members of the Devins family coming from the clan today.
Descended from that original family?
From that original family. And I've met a few of them, and it was just very interesting.
I'd love to think that they're crazy interested in their own personal family history, are they?
They are. You know, the Devins family, they have family reunions and they keep their family history together, and they're one group that definitely follows their family history, and it's really endearing.
I got to tell you, I enjoyed the book. It really does put you in the time. The plot twists and turns all over the place. I enjoyed your made-up conversations, for what it's worth. And I'm not going to give away the ending. But
Good.
it's yeah, I won't do that. But it is a really neat ending, and it's a really neat book. And I'm really glad that you came in today and talked a bit about it with us. You and I are not done, though, because we're going to have you come back tomorrow, and we want to bring the story forward to the War of 1812, which was, in some respects, a shining moment for this brand new, very small little place called Canada, which technically wasn't even Canada yet. So you want to come back tomorrow and we'll continue the conversation?
Definitely.
That's Janice Phillip. The name of the book is The Silent Canoe. And if you love history and you'd like to be taken back to a certain time when the Devinses and the Jarvises were all running amok here in this city, you'll enjoy it.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.